They sentenced the alien prince to airlock death, but a human held the door shut with his own hands. The trial was a sham, and everyone aboard the Resolute knew it, though no one dared to voice it aloud, not when the officers watched from raised platforms like hawks circling prey, and the lowly crew kept their heads bowed, hoping that silence might keep them safe. Yet the accused, an alien prince with silvered skin and eyes like molten amber, stood shackled in the center of the chamber, his dignity intact even as every word hurled against him was twisted, exaggerated, or fabricated. And the human, pilot named Marcus Hale, sat at the back of the hall with his fists clenched so tightly the knuckles whitened, his stomach churning with a mixture of anger and disbelief, because he had seen enough of wars and enough of propaganda to recognize when justice had been murdered in the name of theater. Yet what struck him hardest was the absolute stillness with which the alien prince endured the lies, as though he had expected this betrayal long before the gavel struck, as though the verdict had been written in the stars before he had even boarded this cursed ship. And Marcus could not shake the memory of the night before, when he had been assigned to escort duty and had seen the prince sitting in his cell, head bowed, but whispering words Marcus could not understand, words that sounded like prayer or farewell, words that somehow made Marcus feel the weight of centuries pressing down on one individual. And though he had never spoken to him beyond a curt exchange, something in those amber eyes had told Marcus that he was no monster, no executioner, no traitor, but rather a prisoner of circumstance and politics. And as the ship's captain rose to deliver the sentence with a voice so rehearsed it might have been scripted weeks in advance, Marcus felt the sick truth coil inside him. This was not law. This was spectacle, a warning to the crew and to every species watching across the galaxy that human command brooked no dissent, and so the words rang out like gunfire across the silent chamber. By order of the Admiralty and under martial decree, the alien known as Prince Kale of the Viridians is hereby sentenced to death by airlock, execution to be carried out immediately. And a chill swept through the gathered ranks, not of sorrow but of fear, fear that to protest would mean sharing his fate. And Marcus felt his breath quicken, his body instinctively tightening as the guards moved to drag the alien prince away. But Kale did not resist. He walked with the same unbroken dignity as before, though Marcus noticed a slight tremor in his steps, noticed how his hands tightened into fists as the heavy doors opened to the execution corridor, and something inside Marcus snapped, a sudden blaze of fury at the sheer cruelty of it all, because he could not reconcile the image of that quiet figure in the cell, whispering to ancestors or gods, or perhaps to no one at all, with the sentence of being thrown into the void like garbage, and before his mind even caught up with his body he was rising, shoving through the rows of silent crew, his boots echoing on the metal floor. And when the guards reached the airlock controls, Marcus was there, slamming into them with a violence born of desperation, sending one sprawling, the other crashing into the bulkhead, and suddenly the room erupted in shouts and alarms. Yet Marcus barely heard any of it, his hands gripping the airlock door, his back pressed against it as if his own weight could hold it closed forever, and behind him he felt Kale's breath, quick and uneven, the chains rattling as the prince struggled to keep his footing, and Marcus turned just enough to see those amber eyes widen in shock, confusion, and something else, something like hope. And though Marcus had never in his life spoken more than a handful of words to the alien, his voice came out steady as he growled, "They'll have to kill me before they throw you out there." And the silence that followed was heavier than the alarms, heavier than the footsteps pounding closer, because for the first time in years Marcus Hale felt himself standing not as a soldier bound by orders, but as a man defying them, and the choice he made in that heartbeat would burn through every chapter of his life to come. The alarms had barely silenced after the near execution, when the ship seemed to hold its breath, the corridors filled with whispers and accusations, and Marcus found himself at the center of a storm he could neither escape nor allow to consume him. For though his hands still burned from holding the airlock shut against the force of the vacuum that had nearly claimed the alien prince, his mind burned hotter with the knowledge that every crew member who had seen his Defiance now regarded him as both traitor and savior, depending on which faction their hearts leaned toward. And it was in that fragile, breaking moment that the human realized his life was forever bound to the survival of the alien prince who, by all laws of war and command, should already be drifting in silence among the stars. The alien prince, whose name Marcus finally coaxed through gasping breaths in the dim mid-bay, was Kalen, heir to a throne the Confederacy despised, accused of orchestrating raids and massacres Marcus had never witnessed, but which filled the propaganda reels played in the mess hall each night to remind the human crew who their enemy was supposed to be. Yet when Kalen's eyes fluttered open under the glow of diagnostic lights, Marcus saw not the monster described in military briefings, but a young man scarred by chains, his voice raw from screaming against a death sentence. And in that fragile recognition Marcus felt the line between enemy and ally dissolve, for how could someone branded as an unfeeling tyrant speak his name with such exhausted humanity? Still, there was no time for reflection, for the ship was fracturing around them. Officers furious that Marcus had defied a direct execution order, soldiers divided between fear of command and an uneasy admiration for the man who had held steel doors closed with his bare strength, and whispers grew into shouts as groups formed in the barracks, some calling Marcus a traitor, others murmuring that perhaps the Confederacy had lied, perhaps the alien prince was not the monster they had been taught to believe. Kalen, weak but recovering, felt the weight of this division, and though his body trembled from blood loss, and his wrists bore the angry red bands of restraint cuffs, his gaze carried a strange resilience, as though he had endured worse betrayals before, and in hushed exchanges between fevered dreams, he confessed to Marcus the truth of his capture, how he had not been commanding fleets, but negotiating surrender terms when his escort ship was ambushed, how the Confederacy silenced his envoys, and fabricated crimes to justify the endless war. And though Marcus wanted desperately to believe every word, a soldier's caution gnawed at him, demanding proof beyond whispers from lips too bruised to speak without pain. Days passed in tense silence, the med-bay guarded not by appointed sentries, but by Marcus himself, who sat with his rifle across his knees, daring anyone to enter without answering for their intent, and in that silence bonds grew, fragile and unexpected, as Kalen began to ask questions of humanity, why they feared what they did not understand, why they believed bloodlines determined guilt, why a soldier like Marcus, sworn to follow orders, would risk his life to keep another breathing when every law said otherwise. And Marcus, fumbling for answers, realized that perhaps he too did not understand the roots of his defiance, only that something inside him refused to watch another being swallowed by the void. But the ship was not patient, and neither were its officers, for whispers reached the captain's ears that discipline had fractured, that a human soldier had defied protocol for an enemy prince, and that insubordination festered like rot in the metal veins of the vessel. And thus summons came for Marcus, who was dragged before a tribunal assembled in haste, his hands bound as though he were already guilty, Kalen's survival cited as evidence of betrayal. The tribunal was brutal in its accusations, officers spitting words like treachery and mutiny, demanding Marcus explain why he placed his body between the airlock and an enemy condemned to death. And though every instinct screamed for silence, Marcus found his voice firm, declaring not allegiance to Kalen, but allegiance to something higher, to the belief that justice was not execution without trial, that honor was not obedience to orders that reeked of cowardice and political cover-ups. And in that speech, unpolished but raw, murmurs rippled through the assembly, some scowls tightening, others faltering as if seeds of doubt had been planted where none should exist. Yet the tribunal was never meant to be fair, for its outcome had been decided before Marcus stepped inside, and the sentence was to be confinement, reassignment to hard labor on the ship's lower decks, and disarmament to ensure he could not interfere again. But when guards tried to seize him, an unexpected cry rose from the ranks of ordinary soldiers watching from the back, men and women who had seen Kalen's bruises, who had felt unease at the haste of the execution, and who had begun to question whether they were fighting an enemy at all or serving the lies of commanders who profited from endless war, and their refusal to let Marcus be taken spread like fire, chaos erupting as fists flew and loyalty lines crumbled. In that eruption, Marcus escaped not by cunning but by chaos, slipping back to the medbay where Kalen waited. The alien prince's face pale but determined, and though Marcus wanted to keep him hidden, Kalen insisted they move, insisted that survival lay not in shadows but in truth, that the crew must see him not as a propaganda phantom, but as a man breathing, bleeding, and capable of words the Confederacy feared. Together, limping and desperate, they crossed steel corridors lit by red alarms, crew gathering in stunned silence as Kalen spoke in a voice hoarse yet commanding, not begging for mercy, but demanding they question why they had nearly thrown a prince to death without hearing his crimes, why they fought wars where truth was buried under orders, why humanity, with all its ideals of freedom and justice, now carried chains in its own name, and the silence that followed was heavier than battle itself, the crew staring as though a mirror had been held up to their souls. Some still spat curses, others whispered prayers, but Marcus saw something shifting, the beginning of fracture in loyalty that no officer could easily repair. And though the danger grew with every heartbeat, though punishment loomed like the vacuum beyond the hull, Marcus felt a strange surge of hope, for he realized they were no longer fighting for survival alone, but for a chance to tear down lies woven too long. And for the first time since the airlock doors had slammed shut, he believed that, perhaps saving Kalen had not just been defiance, but destiny. Yet destiny was fragile, and as sirens wailed anew, signaling that command was moving to crush dissent before it spread further, Marcus knew that the next hours would decide not only their lives, but the fate of the crew, for the line between traitor and liberator was razor thin, and all it would take was one choice, one spark, to turn the ship into either their tomb or their revolution. The alarms never stopped ringing across the ship, and the deck seemed to groan like an old beast in pain, as though even the metal itself knew that something irreversible had been set in motion, for the choice Jack had made when he held that airlock door with his bare hands had not only spared the alien prince, but had shattered the careful illusions of discipline and loyalty that the Terran fleet had enforced with fear for decades. And now every corridor seemed charged with the whisper of rebellion. Every crew member watching the next for signs of doubt or fire in the eyes, and as Jack staggered from that moment of defiance into the heart of the war that awaited him, he realized that saving one life might ignite something greater than either human or alien could control. The alien prince stood beside him, his breathing ragged, his body scarred by restraints and humiliation, but his eyes blazing with a nobility that had not been extinguished despite all that had been taken from him. And when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of entire worlds. "You broke your chains for me, human," the prince said softly, yet the words rang louder than the alarms. "And now they will hunt you until the stars turn cold, but I will not let that sacrifice be wasted." Jack didn't answer immediately, because his muscles still trembled from the strain, the bones in his arms screaming after pressing against metal and vacuum, yet inside he felt a fire he had never known before. A fire that told him that standing against cruelty, even in the smallest act, was worth more than following orders written in blood, and he finally said, "Then let's make it count." Together they moved through the ship like hunted prey, but neither of them moved with fear, for fear had been burned away in the furnace of that airlock. Instead, they moved with the clarity of men who had already chosen to die if need be. It did not take long before the captain's wrath descended, his voice echoing through the speakers of the ship, his rage almost tangible as he demanded obedience, demanded loyalty, demanded that the crew capture Jack and the alien prince at once, promising rewards for betrayal and punishment for hesitation. But the corridors did not fill with soldiers immediately, and that was when Jack realized something staggering. His act had been seen, recorded, felt, and the hearts of some were no longer the captains to command. Shadows lingered in the eyes of crewmen who passed them without drawing weapons, and in that silence Jack understood the truth. Even tyrannies have cracks, and sometimes all it takes is one human hand holding shut the door of injustice to split them open. Still, the ship was not yet theirs, and the captain's loyalists soon rallied, storming the lower decks with rifles and stun rods, forcing Jack and the alien prince into a desperate sprint through maintenance shafts and forgotten corridors, lined with pipes that hissed and dripped like veins of the ship itself. There in the dark the prince spoke again, his words more urgent. They call me their enemy, their prisoner, their threat. But if I fall again, it will not be me who suffers. It will be my people, those who still wait for me in the ashes of war. If you are willing, I can guide you to the core of this vessel, where the command can be undone. Jack, panting and bleeding from scrapes against the rusted walls, only nodded, because words seemed too small compared to the weight of what he had chosen. They reached the engine decks, where the heat made every breath thick, and the sounds of pursuit echoed louder. The stomping boots of soldiers who believed they were hunting two-cornered animals. Yet Jack's grip on his blaster was steady, and the prince's presence was like a flame that would not yield, and together they turned the narrow passages into traps. Jack fired with precision, not to kill but to slow, to confuse, to show that the man they had once called a soldier now fought for something truer. And the prince, though weakened, used knowledge of the ship's design gleaned from captivity to lead Jack through systems and junctions even the Terran crew barely knew, proving again and again that survival was not luck, but resolve. Every clash left Jack more bruised. Every skirmish left the prince more drained. Yet in each other's eyes they saw not defeat, but a strange, fierce bond, as though the universe had conspired to place two beings from different stars in the same crucible and dared them to forge something greater than bloodlines or empires. By the time they burst into the command deck, the battle behind them was still echoing, but the real war waited in front of them. The captain stood at the center of the deck like a monument of iron, his uniform crisp, his face carved in stone, his weapon already drawn and aimed directly at Jack's chest. "You had one duty, soldier," the captain said, his voice trembling not with fear but with the fury of betrayal. "And you spat on the flag. Spat on your own kind for what? For a monster that would have watched us all burn." Jack met his gaze without flinching, his body aching, his thoughts sharp, and he answered not with the rehearsed obedience of a trained officer, but with the raw honesty of a man who had finally seen. "He is not the monster," Jack said firmly. "But maybe we are if we can't see the life standing in front of us. You taught me to fight for humanity, Captain, and I am doing just that, because humanity means more than cruelty. It means more than killing. It means choosing to be better." The silence after his words was heavy, and in that silence even the crew on the deck, armed and loyal, hesitated, their weapons wavering as the seeds of doubt that had been growing since the airlock finally found soil. The captain snarled, seeing the weakness, and raised his weapon to fire, but before he could the alien prince stepped forward, his voice thunderous despite his weakness. "Enough. If you would call me monster, then let your fear be burned away by truth. I am not your enemy. I am a son of worlds that want only to live, and this human, this man, has shown more courage, more honor, than all your fleet combined. If you want my death, then strike me now. But know that my blood will not quench your empire's thirst. It will ignite the stars against you." His words rolled like thunder, and for a heartbeat even the captain faltered. But his pride was too great, his thirst for control too deep, and he fired anyway. Jack moved without thinking, throwing himself into the path, his body taking the searing blast that was meant for the prince, and as he felt a one-knee pain tearing through him, he still found the strength to laugh, because he knew that even in that moment the crew's eyes had changed. They saw not a traitor, but a man who would rather bleed than bow, and in that instant the tide broke. The crew surged, not against Jack, not against the prince, but against their captain. Weapons turned, voices rose, orders shattered, and the captain, realizing too late that he had lost not to force but to conviction, tried to fight, tried to cling to the authority that had already crumbled, but he was dragged down, disarmed, his voice drowned by the roar of those who had once served him blindly. The alien prince caught Jack as he collapsed, his hands trembling not from weakness, but from the weight of gratitude and grief, and whispered, "You gave me back my life, human. I will not waste it." Jack, vision fading, managed to smile despite the pain and said, "Then fly far, and don't let them chain you again." And though he felt darkness tugging at him, he knew it was not the end, because the fire he had lit was no longer his alone. It had spread through hearts that would never again bow so easily. In the days that followed the mutiny, the Terran fleet reeled, and the name of the human who had once held an airlock door with his bare hands became more than a whisper. It became a symbol. Jack was kept alive by the care of those who once called him comrade and now called him brother, and the alien prince stood beside him not as a prisoner but as an equal, as a leader whose scars were no longer chains but banners of survival. Together they shaped something new, not an alliance of convenience, but a bond forged in defiance, a bond that said across the stars that a human's choice could change an empire and that mercy was more powerful than fear. And as Jack stood at last, his body still bearing the pain, but his heart carrying no regret, he watched the alien prince prepare to speak to a galaxy that had waited too long, and he felt the truth settle in his chest like a final victory. He had not saved a life. He had saved the meaning of what it was to be alive.